The hurricane's name was Milton, but the name alone did not do justice to the devastation it wrought. Born in the warm waters of the Atlantic, Milton grew with an eerie speed, spiraling into a Category 5 monster as it hurtled toward the Florida coast. The warnings had been clear: evacuate now or risk certain death. News channels filled with grim updates, describing how the storm had already consumed entire towns, wiping them off the map like they had never existed. But something far more malevolent than nature itself rode within the winds of Hurricane Milton. For those who stayed, who dared to face its wrath, it wasn't just the water and the winds they had to fear. There was something ancient, something vengeful lurking in the storm. And it didn't just want to destroy, it wanted to consume. Natalie O'Brien had always considered herself a survivor. Hurricanes were a part of life growing up in coastal Florida, and she prided herself on her ability to remain calm in the face of catastrophe. But as the first gusts of Milton's winds tore through her small town, rattling the windows of her childhood home, Natalie began to feel an unnatural chill deep in her bones, a sense of dread that no amount of preparation could have warded off. This wasn't just a storm, it was a warning. Natalie's family home stood at the edge of a small town, miles from the shore, nestled among the ancient trees that had withstood decades of storms. Her father had built the house himself, reinforcing it with extra layers of protection. But that night, as the winds howled and trees snapped like matchsticks, she realized that no amount of fortification could protect her from what was coming. The power had gone out hours ago, plunging the house into darkness, save for the dim, flickering light of the few candles she'd managed to find. The radio was her only connection to the outside world, and it crackled with the disembodied voice of an emergency broadcaster. Reports of rising waters, collapsed buildings, and disappearances filtered through the static, each more horrific than the last. "Do not leave your home," the voice on the radio commanded. "Stay inside and remain calm." But how could she remain calm when the walls of her house groaned as if under immense pressure, and the air inside seemed thick with an invisible force? The temperature dropped drastically despite the storm's tropical origin. It felt like something was pressing in on her from all sides. And then came the sound of low, rhythmic thumping, like something large and heavy was walking around the house, circling it, waiting. Natalie's breath caught in her throat as she moved toward the window, her body trembling with each step. Outside, the storm raged, but through the sheets of rain and the flicker of lightning, she saw it. A dark figure, impossibly tall, standing just beyond the tree line. The figure's eyes glowed faintly, like burning embers, and it stood motionless, staring directly at her. Natalie stumbled back, her heart racing, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had seen. She wanted to believe it was just her imagination, a trick of the storm. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. By morning, the winds had weakened, but the damage was done. Milton had torn through the town like a beast, leaving behind wreckage and ruin. Natalie ventured outside, cautious but desperate to see if anyone else had survived. The streets were littered with debris, pieces of homes, cars overturned, power lines down. But there was something more disturbing, something she couldn't explain. There were no people. Not a single person could be seen wandering the streets, calling for help, or even sifting through the ruins of their homes. It was as if the entire population had simply vanished. As Natalie moved deeper into town, she found more signs of life: doors left wide open, personal belongings scattered in the mud, vehicles parked with their doors ajar. But still, no one. And then she heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind, like the distant call of someone in distress. It was coming from the old church at the center of town, a place that had been a refuge for countless hurricanes before. She hurried toward the sound, her heart pounding with both hope and fear. When she reached the church, she found the doors unlocked. Inside, it was eerily quiet, the pews empty except for a single figure kneeling at the altar. It was Father Michael, the town's priest, and he was muttering a prayer, his hands trembling. "Father," Natalie called, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, his eyes wide and filled with terror. "They took them," he whispered. "The storm wasn't just wind and rain. It was something else, something evil." They came in the night, and they took everyone. Natalie's blood ran cold. Who took them? Father Michael pointed toward the shattered stained glass window at the back of the church. The shadows, he whispered, the ones that walk in the storm. Father Michael explained what little he could. He spoke of ancient folklore, stories passed down through generations of sailors and fishermen, about storms that were more than just natural disasters. In these tales, the storms were living, breathing entities, beings of pure malevolence, waiting for the right conditions to cross into the world of the living. They come when the storm is at its strongest, the priest said, his voice shaking. They feed on fear, on the terror of those trapped inside. And once they've taken what they want, they disappear, leaving nothing behind. Natalie's heart raced as she listened to his words. The figure she had seen in the storm, could it have been one of these creatures? And if so, what did it want with her? As she and Father Michael huddled inside the church, the storm began to intensify once again. Milton's eye had passed, and the second wave of the storm was closing in. The air outside grew heavy, oppressive, and the once distant thumping returned closer this time, as if the shadows were closing in on them. Suddenly, the church doors burst open, and the wind howled inside, carrying with it a deep, guttural growl. Natalie and Father Michael barely had time to react before the shadows began to seep through the cracks in the walls, their forms twisting and writhing as they entered the sanctuary. "They're here," Father Michael gasped, clutching his crucifix. "We must stand together, don't give in to the fear." But the shadows had already chosen their prey. What followed was a nightmare beyond comprehension. The shadows moved with unnatural speed, circling Natalie and the priest, their eyes glowing with a hunger that chilled her to the bone. They whispered in a language she couldn't understand, their voices like the rustling of dead leaves. Father Michael raised his crucifix, chanting prayers with a desperation that echoed through the empty church. For a moment, the shadows seemed to recoil, their forms flickering as if repelled by the holy words. But then, with a sound like a breaking dam, the crucifix shattered in his hands, and the shadows surged forward. The priest screamed as the darkness enveloped him, dragging him into the abyss. Natalie could only watch, frozen in place as his body was consumed by the shadows, disappearing into the swirling mass of darkness. And then, just as quickly as they had come, the shadows vanished, leaving behind only silence. Natalie was alone. The storm raged outside, but inside the church, a deep, suffocating quiet had settled. She could feel their eyes on her, even though they were no longer visible. They were waiting, watching, biding their time. And then, as if in answer to her thoughts, the whispers returned louder, more insistent this time. "Come to us." With no one left to turn to, Natalie did the only thing she could think of. She ran. She fled the church, her footsteps echoing through the empty streets as the storm closed in around her. The shadows followed, gliding effortlessly through the rain, their whispers growing louder with each passing second. "Come to us." She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away. The streets were a labyrinth of debris and flooded roads, and every corner she turned seemed to bring her closer to the inevitable. The shadows were toying with her, driving her toward something, and deep down, she knew what it was. The storm wasn't just a random act of nature. It had come for her. Desperate and exhausted, Natalie found herself at the edge of the town, standing before the ocean. The waves crashed violently against the shore, the water churning with the same ferocity as the storm overhead. And there, just beyond the breakers, she saw the figure from the night before. It stood at the water's edge, its eyes glowing like twin embers in the darkness. It was waiting for her. Natalie's legs trembled as she approached the figure, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what it wanted, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. The storm, the shadows, the whispers, they all led to this moment. The figure raised its hand, beckoning her closer. Its voice, deep and resonant, echoed in her mind. "You were chosen." Chosen? For what? The figure stepped forward, its form shifting and twisting like the storm itself. As it drew nearer, Natalie felt a crushing weight settle over her, pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. "Fear is the key," the figure whispered, its voice like the roar of the wind. Fear opens the door. Natalie's mind raced. She could feel the shadows closing in around her, their whispers filling her ears. They wanted her to give in, to let the fear consume her, but something inside her resisted. She thought of her father, of the strength he had instilled in her, and she stood her ground. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I won't." The figure paused, its burning eyes narrowing. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. And then, with a deafening roar, the storm intensified, the wind screaming in fury as the shadows swarmed around her. But Natalie didn't move. She faced the storm, faced the shadows, and refused to let them take her. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The wind died, the rain ceased, and the shadows evaporated into the night. The figure was gone. Natalie stood alone at the edge of the ocean, the storm having passed, leaving behind a town in ruins and a deep, unsettling silence. But she had survived. Days later, when the authorities arrived to assess the damage, they found Natalie wandering through the remains of her town. She was the only survivor. They asked her what had happened, but she couldn't explain. She couldn't tell them about the shadows, the whispers, or the figure in the storm. They wouldn't believe her. But even now, as she sits in a shelter miles away from the coast, she can still hear it, the faint whisper of the wind, calling her name, waiting for her to return. The storm may have passed, but for Natalie, the nightmare is far from over. The malevolent force that rode within Hurricane Milton still lingers, watching, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. And as the whispers grow louder, she knows that one day, the storm will come for her again.